just absorb you without you realizing. All right, everybody. So we are going to start our tafsir. And inshallah, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And we may are going to start we may need to, well, basically we have to end on time because I have an appointment to go to, but inshallah, we're going to do this, okay? Still. And here we go. So we've got, let's look at what we were doing. So we were doing our ayat yesterday, and let's look into those ayat. And we kind of had some conversation yesterday in regards to the Old Testament and all of that. So let's go up there and find our, was it 135 or something? I believe it was 135. Am I right? Yeah, good job. I remembered it. Okay, let's do it. And we went in details with this ayah, right? Let's look into it. We went in details with this ayah. إذ قال الله يا عيسى ابن مريم اذكر نعمتي عليك وعلى والدتك إذ أيدتك. Notice here this dal right there is actually gray. In the color-coded Tajweed Quran, I know there are some that are in complete opposition to the color-coded Tajweed Quran. I'm actually in complete favor. And I don't have a problem with the color-coded Tajweed Quran because as long as the person is reading the Quran right with Tajweed, so if I have a way to indicate a qalqala using a light blue color, well, that's all that matters. They don't necessarily have to know, let's call it the math of the whole tajweed rule, that if it's qutub jad, if it's one of these letters, and if it's sakin or if it's sukun lazim, that I would have to do that shake and bake in it. That doesn't matter. As long as the person is applying the rule, that's all that matters. And certainly we know that the Prophet ﷺ had read the Quran with tajweed, but didn't necessarily have the physics of it or the math of it because he was basically applying it. It was kind of what they were speaking in anyways. Okay, let's see. So when you look at this ayatuka, this dal is basically silent. Okay, so it's a silent dal when it basically shares the same place of articulation. So we talked about بروح القدس تكلم الناس في المهد وكهلا وإذ علمتك الكتاب والحكمة والتوراة والإنجيل وإذ تخلق من الطين كهيئة الطير بإذني فتنفخ فيها فتكون طيرا بإذني وتبرئ الأكمه والأبرص بإذني وإذ تخرج الموتى بإذني وإذ كففت بني إسرائيل عنك إذ جئتهم بالبينات فقال الذين كفروا إن هذا إلا سحر مبين. And we said in قراءة الكسائي ساحر مبين. وإذ أوحيت إلى الحواريين. Notice this little baby yet right there. That's like a madsila type of thing. الحواريين, not one yeah, but two yes, and that's why they have this one right there. So why didn't they write two yes and just write one yeah? Because even the scribing of the Quran, that itself is tawqifi. Remember that word that we had said before, the word tawqifi? Let's write that word down, right? Tawqifi. And we said tawqifi is basically a term to mean that something was passed down through al-wahi, and therefore we would take it as the way that the Prophet ﷺ had basically taught us it, and therefore we don't do any, let's say, self-interpretation or any addition or any change or any alteration, because it was revealed that way and it will still be that way. So therefore we cannot change anything in it. So even the scribing of it, certainly, what about the dots? What about those harakat, the sukun, the kasra, etc.? So those were added later. But the other pieces of it, some of the noons, for example, some of those did already have dots. Okay, let's continue. أن آمنوا بي وبرسولي قالوا آمنا واشهد بأننا مسلمون. Okay, so we talked about this one yesterday. Let's kind of, pass about with what we had talked about. We talked about إذ أوحيت, and we said that scholars had differences of opinions on what the أوحيت actually means, but generally we said the word أوحى has different interpretations based on the context within the Quran. So we said al-wahi could mean just a general inspiration and could also mean a revelation, basically with Jibreel alayhi salam. It could also mean to give a certain sentiment, a certain feeling, you know, kind of like what we would say in English, a gut feeling. So that gut feeling is also a type of wahi. It's a type of wahi, or sometimes they might say it's like like a sixth sense. It's a type of wahi. But is that wahi only coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Some wahi, pay attention to this one, can come from shayateen. Yes. وَإِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ لَيُوحُونَ إِلَىٰ أَوْلِيَائِهِمْ. Shayateen would also give a certain wahi to their supporters. So be careful with that one. That's why it's really scary. Sometimes people can think that it's a gut feeling, it's a divine thing, and would not realize that it was actually a wahi coming from shaitan. A wahi coming from shaitan, and this wahi coming from shaitan basically can be confused as to others might think of it as it was some kind of a miraculous thing and it was coming to them, but in reality it was actually a satanic inspiration. Okay, let's see. And we also talked about وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ, that some of the inspiration was also going to, for example, bees or different animals or different people like Musa. And sometimes it can be during a person being awake or even during sleep. Then would have asked the question about, well, sleep and dreams, can that be a form of wahi? So we answered and we went in details in regards to that. And Abu Ubaidah, the famous scholar, that he actually said, أوحيت إلى الحواريين, to mean I had ordered al-Hawariyin. So they felt the inspiration that it was mandatory, that it was obligatory, that it was a mission that they must carry on to, one, to believe in Allah Almighty, to believe in the Prophet, and to basically say amanna, to basically announce their faith, and washhad bi annana muslimun, to basically announce that they are Muslim and not Christian. Okay, so right there, of course, وَقِيلَ أَوْحَيْتُ بِمَعْمَنَا أَمَرْتُهُم, and we left off at this ayah. إِذْ قَالَ الْحَوَارِيُّونَ يَا عِيسَى ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ. Here we go again. إذ قال الحواريون يا عيسى ابن مريم هل يستطيع ربك أن ينزل علينا مائدة من السماء قال اتقوا الله إن كنتم مؤمنين. إذ قال الحواريون. So let's talk about this one. Let's say, so إذ قال الحواريون, so الحواريين, basically the disciples, or is it the apostles? So in the end, if we're speaking about the direct followers that were, of course, they were learning directly from Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So think of it as a Sahaba. So then they started asking, is your Lord capable of sending down a dinner or supper from the heavens? He responded, fear your Lord Almighty if you are true believers. Is that necessarily the interpretation or the accurate interpretation? I would say, let's go further in order to see what other scholars and how other scholars might actually interpret that. Let's see. So some scholars actually said that there is another qira'ah, and that is by al-Kisai, Sa'id ibn Jubair, Ibn Abbas, etc. So those, well, Mujahid, Sa'id ibn Jubair are basically tabi'een, and that's going to be the generation after the Sahaba. So Sa'id ibn Jubair and Mujahid, they basically learned from the Sahaba. Ibn Abbas and Ali ibn Abi Talib were Sahaba. Al-Kisai basically got his qira'ah going back to the Prophet ﷺ, so it is qira'ah mutawatira. Let me use that word for a bit and let me explain it. What is mutawatir? Okay, so when we say mutawatir, is every single variant qira'ah necessarily mutawatir? The answer is no. Not every single variant reading is necessarily mutawatir. Wait a minute. So what is mutawatir anyways? So mutawatir simply means in Arabic, we would say ما رواه جمع عن جمع يستحيل تواطؤهم عن الكذب عادة. Okay? عن الكذب عادة. So what does that mean? Okay. So what that means is that, for example, we would have a certain qira'ah. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ would read this qira'ah, and a group of Sahaba would hear the qira'ah, or at least that recitation. And then another group of that group of Sahaba would pass it on to another group of Sahaba. Another group of Sahaba would be passed on from generation to a generation till probably got to us. Of course, we're right now speaking about 30 generations between us and the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, the definition of generation is not necessarily every 10 years, but is the generation we're speaking about, a word of mouth that was passed on to another living person. There are 29 people between Dr. Samia Harb and her, between her and the Prophet ﷺ. 29 or 30 people. So it was her mouth taking out of a word of mouth from another qari, from another scholar. The other scholar took it from another scholar, and so forth until we would basically have a whole chain of narration up to 30 people. Okay, up to 30 people. We're talking about generation in history. Okay, 30 people between her and the Prophet. Okay, so that would make it as basically the chain of narration. Now, when we say التواتر would mean that I would have a group that heard the Prophet ﷺ say something, and this group would pass it on to another group, and another group would pass it on to another group, and so forth. That's tawatur. Okay, it's impossible for them to make up a lie. Okay, that's tawatur. So are all qira'at, are all variant recitations, are they all mutawatir? The answer is no. We have 7 qira'at, we have 7 variant readings that are mutawatir, and we have 3 more, or actually 7 more, 7 others that have differences of opinions on whether they are mutawatir, or some may, let's say, contain some mutawatir and some not. Okay, so when you're looking at this one, قراءة الكسائي is mutawatir. Okay, that he read in another variant qira'ah that was, did al-Kisai make it up? No. It was actually something that the Prophet ﷺ had read himself. Okay, what is that other qira'ah? هل تستطيع? Wait a minute. So what is our qira'ah anyways? What qira'ah are we doing? Well, in general, we are doing رواية حفص عن عاصم. Here we go. In general, we're doing رواية حفص عن عاصم. Okay. Now, قراءة الكسائي is actually also coming that the Prophet ﷺ also read it in a variant qira'ah, هل تستطيع. So our qira'ah is basically saying هل يستطيع, هل يستطيع, not تستطيع. So what's the difference in interpretation? What's the difference in meaning? So the difference in meaning is going to be, one, will your Lord Almighty answer your prayer if you had asked him to send down a meal or a supper? That's the question. If we are saying, هل يستطيع, is your Lord capable of sending down a meal for us? Okay, look at the difference. Are you capable? In between, is your Lord capable? So that's the different qira'ah, and you could see the different meaning. Okay, let's see. So the other question is, well, were they actually doubting, or what did they really live in? Was this some form of a doubt, or was this wanting some kind of yaqeen? So let me explain a couple things here. Remember, the the levels of certainty in Islam, you got something called علم اليقين. There's the حق اليقين, and there's عين اليقين. Okay, so what does that mean and what's the difference? So علم اليقين is basically something that you know in theory. Okay, you understand, you did the experiment, you know in theory, but then حق اليقين, you know it. Yes, you had done your homework, you had done your empirical studies, your observation, and all of that was basically telling you that, yes, this is basically something you're certain about. You've got, not only did you do the theoretical, but you also did some experiments, and now you're embedding the theoretical with the empirical, and that's giving you to a certain level of certainty. But then عين اليقين is when your level of certainty had basically become so strong that it's kind of like an observing. It's like the level of seeing, when we would say seeing is believing. That's exactly what it is. Observing. Am I reading this right? Observing. Okay. So we're speaking about seeing is believing. So عين اليقين. Okay, so now these are the different stages of ma'rifah. Okay, where did we get that even from? We got it from سورة التكاثر. ألهاكم التكاثر حتى زرتم المقابر كلا سوف تعلمون. Here's the first one. كلا سوف تعلمون. ثم كلا سوف تعلمون. كلا لو تعلمون علم اليقين. Okay, علم اليقين. And then لترونها عين اليقين. Here's عين اليقين. So now we know علم اليقين, حق اليقين, and عين اليقين. So did they necessarily, the question is, did they necessarily have any doubt whatsoever? If they had the doubt, that would simply contradict faith. And if they were considered as the selected people, the selected followers of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, then it's okay to have doubt. Were they really doubting? That was the debate that the scholars in Tafsir really had. How do we understand this ayah? Were they living doubt? Was this not related to doubt? So let's go further down and actually see what and why did they even ask Prophet Isa alayhi salam to make the dua to get a meal to be sent from the heavens. Why did they ask for that? So that's the whole thing that is related to the tafsir for this ayah. Okay, so here's one. Let's see the first one. The first interpretation basically said, well, what that means is they were asking whether the Lord Almighty is capable of sending down a meal, and that was the first interpretation. The first interpretation is basically saying, well, is your Lord capable? And that interpretation was saying, well, that was before faith had really went into their hearts, and before them knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fully. So that was kind of like their first stage of Iman. They were still, hey, new converts. They still didn't completely yet get into the preaching, the practices, embracing the ilm and what Prophet Isa alayhi salam was teaching them about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they said, well, that's why the Prophet Prophet Isa alayhi salam, he basically scolded them and said, "Ittaqullaha in kuntum mu'minin." Have fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you were true believers. You know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing that. In other words, don't doubt the Lord Almighty's powers. Now, Al-Qurtubi wasn't happy at all with this interpretation. And here's why. He said, well, that doesn't, look at the word, look at the adab. He said, وَهَذَا فِيهِ نَظَرٌ. I want you to look at the adab. What does وَهَذَا فِيهِ نَظَرٌ mean? هذا فيه نظر. In English, we could say, well, this requires further scrutiny. Even though, if you were to read more about what he was saying, he was definitely objecting and disagreeing with this interpretation. But out of adab, he just said, هذا فيه نظر. This just deserves more scrutiny. I think this needs better research. Maybe more research is needed, even though he completely objects this interpretation. And here's why he objected to it. He said, well, because al-Hawariyin, with the disciples, are actually chosen by the Lord Almighty, or at least endorsed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they were basically the supporters for the Prophet Isa alayhi salam. They were basically anointed. They were basically, hey, selected as being the best of the followers. And after all, we know in Surah As-Saf that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had endorsed them, and endorsing them in this ayah when Prophet Isa alayhi salam was telling the people, his people, man ansari ilallah, who's going to be supporting me to the path of the Lord Almighty? And he said, quote, قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله. Al-Hawariyun basically said, we are the ones to victory you on the path of the Lord Almighty. Now, and he said, well, that's similar to how Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he said, لِكُلِّ نَبِيٍّ حَوَارِيٌّ وَحَوَارِيَّ الزُّبَيْرِ. Every single prophet has a hawari, and my hawari is a Zubayr. Wait a minute. Every prophet has a hawari, and my hawari is a Zubayr. And so what does that mean? Every single prophet has a hawari to actually mean like there's a selected group of followers, and his hawari, or his selected follower, the direct student, let's say it that way, is a Zubayr out of all. So how do we put these pieces together? And he said, well, it's known that all the prophets had basically come to teach about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what we're supposed to be doing and what we're not supposed to be doing. In other words, understanding the Lord Almighty, and therefore they basically had a mission, and they certainly understood the mission, and that mission was to deliver the message to the people. And if they were there, and when, of course, man ansari ilallah is to basically say, well, who's going to be supporting me? There's no way that they're going to be supporting per se if they didn't even know what the mission was all about. So Al-Qurtubi objected to that because he said, well, it's impossible that they would be the ones to be on the mission and make such a catastrophic mistake and doubt the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or even doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and that would contradict faith. Okay, that would contradict faith. So now here, of course, he's also said it is also possible that that could have happened. Notice that he's, just like he had said, وَهَذَا فِيهِ نَظَرٌ, he was also, I guess, coming to say, well, but it is possible that that might have happened, or that was something that they probably articulated from, at least some of them had said that, not all of them. So we're speaking about some had said that, possibly, just like some of those that were ignorant from the Arab, or al-A'rab, basically, when they had told the Prophet ﷺ, اجعل لنا ذات أنواط كما لهم ذات أنواط. Were they part of the Sahaba? Yes. But were they considered as the, let's say, the selected or the best Sahaba? What was the whole story here? So during the Battle of Hunayn, you had some Arab, well, they had encountered some other people. Anwar is basically something that they would hang on a tree, but at that time, they used to see that hanging something on a tree in a certain way, it was done somewhat in a way to bring about good luck. Okay, so these people coming to the Prophet ﷺ said, well, just like they have something to bring them good luck, is it possible that you could also make something in the religion to bring us good luck in the same way as a lucky charm, as something that would give us maybe a way for victory, just like they would hang something on a tree in a specific way? Can we also get something like that? Which is very similar to what happened to Prophet Musa. His people said, اجعل لنا إلها كما لهم آلهة. Can you make us a deity? Can you make us a god? Can you make us like an idol to remind us of God, something on ground that we can sense, that we can feel, rather this distant God? And can you make us some God that is near to us, just like these pagans have a nearby God that they can sense and touch? That's when, of course, Al-Qurtubi and certainly the other Mufassirin, they basically said, well, it wasn't all the Hawariyin, but it was probably some Hawariyin that basically had said, well, can you ask Allah Almighty to send us a meal? Is that part of it? Is that basically falling in this moment of doubt? How do we understand that? Let's continue with the other interpretation, because this one didn't really give us a complete answer, as much as it was just telling me, well, there's a parable, something similar. You had, even though Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he had his people, they questioned Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You had other people also ask for something really not acceptable, to change the religion in order to match something like the pagans. He said, well, it's probably something similar to that. Let's say the other interpretation. The other interpretation said they didn't doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, didn't doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, because they were in firm belief. Anyways, they already knew about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it is the way, and similar to someone saying, well,
Is that like Ibrahim alayhi salam, how he...
We're going to get there, Noura. We're going to get
Oh,
there.
sorry.
So, and that's basically similar. Is is X or Y and Z capable of doing that? But they already know that he is capable of doing that. They already know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing that. And they already know that in theory, but they wanted something in observation, which is like Ibrahim alayhi salam, like what Noura was anticipating. O Rabbi arini kayfa tuhyi al-mawta. When Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam said, oh Lord, show me how you revive the dead. Did Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power? No. Well, what happened? When he was asked, well, أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ? He said, بَلَى. قَالَ بَلَى وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. He said, verily I did believe. I have very firm belief, so why are you asking for a miracle, Ibrahim? He said, وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. Wanted to reach a level of such deep طمأنينة, such deep... What is a طمأنينة? A طمأنينة is really tranquility. طمأنينة, in terms of ilm, or in terms of knowledge, it's basically living in this level of certainty that nothing shakes it. It's so strong that I know it to the level of عين اليقين. Remember what we said, علم اليقين, حق اليقين, and عين اليقين. He wanted to get to عين اليقين. So this other interpretation, it basically said, وَلِذَلِكَ قَالَ وَتَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُنَا. So the other interpretation said, and we've got the evidence to prove this point. What is it? They said, well, here it is. The ayah said, قَالُوا نِرِيدُ أَن نَأْكُلَ مِنْهَا وَتَطْمَئِنَّ قُلُوبُنَا. They said, we want to eat from it, and we want to get to the level of certainty. Ooh, that's a strong one. وَتَطْمَئِنَّ قُلُوبُنَا. They said it is equivalent to what Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam had said, وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. That's a very, very strong one, isn't it? And that's why Al-Qurtubi said, look at the adab, وَهَذَا تَأْوِيلٌ حَسَنٌ. He said, and this is a good interpretation. And in fact, it would be وأحسن منه أن ذلك كان من قول من كان مع الحواريين. Said, and the best thing to say within this context is that this is part of the حواريين, not all of them, but some of them. This is what they were saying. Not all of them were basically, there's a difference between lisan al-hal and lisan al-maqal. Remember, we talked about that before. And let's write it down. لسان الحال and لسان المقال. لسان الحال is basically, you're not saying anything, but somebody is coming to you and they're coming in, rushing into the door, and they close the door really quick, and you're like, what's going on? Did they say anything? They didn't say anything. But you could see, based on their body language, that they're actually, their body and their behavior is basically saying, I'm afraid, I'm hungry, whatever it is. Okay, that's lisan al-hal. Lisan al-maqal, somebody coming in and basically telling you, hey, I'm afraid, there's something following me, or whatever it is. And now they're saying it in language, in words, okay? So that's lisan al-hal, lisan al-maqal. And is that necessarily that lisan al-hal, or is that lisan al-maqal? Well, when the ayah says qalu, sometimes the Quran can use qalu as a word lisan al-hal, and sometimes lisan al-maqal as well. So is that something that all of them had said, or is this some of them had said? Okay, now the other thing, this one's quite interesting. And here, Ibn al-Arabi. Who's Ibn al-Arabi? Ibn al-Arabi is different than the Sufi Ibn Arabi. The Sufi Ibn Arabi is different, okay? This is Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki from Ishbiliya, or Ishbiliya, al-Andalus, okay? And he said, al-Mustati' is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The 99 names, he said he added al-Mustati'. No one else added that. And he said, it's not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not even as mentioned in the Sunnah, but it was something that was mentioned as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing. In other words, in action. And that's why he used al-Mustati' as one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what is the evidence? And he used هَلْ يَسْتَطِيعُ رَبُّكَ. So by that, he basically said, well, the inference is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Mustati', is the one that is capable. So he made it the one that is capable as one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, well, of course, someone didn't like that, because Ibn al-Hassari basically responded to that. Ibn al-Hassar was a 5th century scholar. Okay, let's see. And he basically responded, he said, well, this isn't necessarily to doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's capability, but this is a form of trying to present adab and mannerisms in making the question. So they already had believed in Prophet Isa alayhi salam. They were actually some of those that had best believed in Prophet Isa alayhi salam. So certainly we can't doubt and assume that they were actually ignorant about all of this. And they basically said, well, كان القوم أعلم بالله عز وجل من أن يقولوا هل يستطيع ربك؟ قالت ولكن هل تستطيع ربك؟ Well, هل تستطيع ربك? She said another قراءة, it's actually هل تستطيع ربك? So what does that even mean? So in لغة عربية, remember, some prepositions in some objects or the subject can be omitted. So هل تستطيع أن تدعو ربك is basically what the sentence would mean. So what does that mean? Are you capable of invoking your Lord Almighty? So it's not تستطيع ربك, but it's هل تستطيع ربك. So ربك would be that مفعول به right there. Okay. In other words, are you, O Jesus, peace be upon you, capable? It's not that they're doubting his capability, but are you willing to? Okay. Are you willing to ask and invoke the Lord Almighty to send down the meal? Okay. And Mu'adh ibn Jabal basically said, I had heard the Prophet ﷺ actually read هل تستطيع ربك many times. So here's the qira'ah, and we've got other Sahaba basically saying, I heard the Prophet ﷺ actually read it this way. Okay. Let's say right there, and we're just going to go over it really quick. So when you say that, is it similar to وَاسْأَلِ الْقَرْيَةِ, that ask the city? Are we really asking the city, or are we asking the people in the city? Okay. Okay, what are you trying to get to? We're trying to get to that there is the evidence that they didn't actually doubt, and they wanted to get to عين اليقين, and that there is another qira'ah that supports the interpretation that they didn't doubt, and that they basically would have the evidence to prove, basically, what that mufassirin, they have the evidence to prove that even when it came to قَالَ اتَّقُوا اللَّهِ, he said, have fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's not necessarily reprimanding them. Wait, how did you get to that point? Okay, remember when Prophet Isa, when they said, هل يستطيع ربك, هل تستطيع ربك? Okay, I know you're saying قراءة حسن عن عاصم هل يستطيع ربك, but the other قراءة هل تستطيع ربك. Okay, just by changing the ta and making it as a fatha right there, that would mean, are you capable of invoking your Lord Almighty? Okay. And then Prophet Isa says, ittaqullah, have taqwa. But just by telling someone have taqwa, that doesn't necessarily mean you're reprimanding them. That doesn't necessarily mean you're reprimanding them for something wrong that they are doing. Why not? Because even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told the Prophet ﷺ, يا أيها النبي اتق الله ولا تطع الكافرين ولا تطع الكافرين والمنافقين. Oh, there you go. Was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reprimanding the Prophet ﷺ? It's not reprimanding. It's basically a type of discipline. It's a type of a direction. Okay? It's not necessarily reprimanding. So here, ittaqullah. How do you get to taqwallah? In kuntum mu'minin. You get to that by practicing faith right there. Okay. So when they said أَيَّتَّقُوا مَعَاصِيهِ وَكَثْرَةِ السُّؤَالِ, that he wanted them to keep away from asking too much. And because if you wanted to get more miracles, you never know when you're asking for more and more things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might hold you more accountable for what you're asking for. And it's kind of like when the Prophet ﷺ, had told the Sahaba that they should not be asking too many questions, because just like in the ayah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had reprimanded them, we had done it in Surah Al-Ma'ida. لا تسألوا عن أشياء تبد لكم تسؤكم. Don't ask about things if the truth of it, or at least if it were to be revealed, it would basically harm you. إن كنتم مؤمنين, if you're really true believers. So you recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does what is best for his servants. إن كنتم مؤمنين, if you were true believers, then all you need to embrace is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now let's continue. قالوا نريد أن نأكل منها وتطمئن قلوبنا. They said, we just want to eat from it, and we just want our hearts to feel that طمأنينة, that tranquility, that certainty, and know that you had sadaqtana, that you had come with truth, and we would come as witnesses upon that. Now, two things. Number one, did they actually want to eat because there was a need to eat? Or did they just want something, certainty, so they thought, well, let's just ask for a meal? Okay, let's see. That's the first opinion. The first opinion basically said they were in need of food, and he had 5,000 people or even more that were accompanying him, and they had asked for food because some of them were getting sick, and some of them were basically lame, or some of them were blind, and some of them were mocking him. And the Prophet Isa alayhi salam, he basically went into an area, of course, in order to stay safe, and they got really hungry. So that's when they asked Prophet Isa alayhi salam to send down a meal and ask for a meal. A guy named Shim'un, or Simon, who was basically the head of the Hawariyin, or the disciples, he told them that people are asking for some meal to be sent from the heavens. But then that's when Prophet Isa alayhi salam tells Simon, or Shim'un, sorry, ittaqullah in kuntum mu'minin. Have taqwa if you're true believers. In other words, you got to be strong. And that's when they said, nuridu an na'kula minha. That's the interpretation. They said, because they said, nuridu an na'kula minha, we just want to eat from it, that there was a need. So this interpretation is saying that, well, it's not that they were seeking certainty alone, but they were also in need. They were in deep hunger, and that they were asking for a miraculous meal somehow because they were already in a mafaza. They were in an area that basically didn't have food, and the only way that was going to be possible is by really getting some miraculous meal to basically protect them at least from starvation. Let's see, the other interpretation said, نَأْكُلُ مِنْهَا فَنَنَالَ بَرَكَتَهَا. The other interpretation, they said, well, they weren't necessarily hungry per se, but they were actually wanting a meal from the heavens in order to get the barakah, the blessings, not because they needed it, but it was seeking a blessing. So that's why here's the other response, they said if they needed a meal for survival, then they would not have been reprimanded from asking for a meal, because you are permitted to ask and make the dua for a meal or for survival, and you wouldn't be reprimanded if it was for the sake of survival. But the second interpretation was saying, well, they were reprimanded for asking for barakah of that meal, and not necessarily because they were in need. So let's see, what about tatma'innu qulubuna? How do you put it within these interpretations? How did they interpret that? So the first one basically said tatma'in ila anna Allah ta'ala ba'athaka ilayna nabiyya. The first interpretation said, well, this is in order to say what they were seeking is that they wanted their hearts to find certainty that Prophet Isa alayhi salam was sent as a prophet. The second interpretation said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had chosen us in order to basically carry on the mission. In other words, that we are true disciples or apostles, and from there, we would just feel that there was some kind of a selection in what we're supposed to be doing as a mission to let us know and feel that. The third interpretation that, well, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had answered our prayer. So we just need something to kind of give us a sense that our prayer was answered, and we would like to see it as something that we could eat and see and really sense. Al-Mahdawi. I know his name sounds like he was some kind of Shia, but no, he's actually a scholar from Tunisia, from a city called Al-Mahdiyah. City in Tunisia called Al-Mahdi. It was a Maliki scholar, of course. He said, أي تطمئن بأن الله قد قبل صومنا وعملنا. He said, well, the interpretation is that they wanted to feel the certainty that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had accepted their fasts and accepted their actions. And therefore, الثعلبي had said, well, that's in order for them to say, وَنَعْلَمَ أَنْ قَدْ صَدَقْتَنَا. In order for us to live and feel that certainty, and our hearts would basically feel at ease that you are the Prophet of Allah, and we are basically witnesses on that, and witnesses that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one, and that you had basically come with the risala, with the revelation, with the prophethood, and certainly that we would like to be witnesses that all of this happened before our eyes right there. So that's when قال عيسى ابن مريم اللهم ربنا أنزل علينا مائدة من السماء تكون لنا عيدا لأولنا وآخرنا وآية منك وارزقنا وأنت خير الرازقين. That's when Isa عليه السلام made the dua, Allahumma ربنا, O Lord Almighty, sent down a meal from the heavens that would be a holy day for us and the later generations, and as a miracle from you, and give us the provisions, for you are the best to give in provision. Isa alayhi salam, when he said, Allahumma, wait a minute. So the word Allah.
I have a question. You said holy day. So what is that talking about?
Okay, we're going to talk about holy day and not holiday. We're going to explain why we said holy day. Okay, well, we're going to talk about that inshallah once we get there. We're still in the beginning. Okay, Noura? Okay, so when we say قال عيسى ابن مريم Allahumma, wait a minute, so was he actually speaking Aramaic or was it in Arabic? So definitely we know that Prophet Isa alayhi salam was not speaking in Arabic. So this is, let's call it the interpretation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically made in Surat, or at least for all the different prophets, basically put it in Arabic. Okay, so where does the word Allahumma, is that like hallelujah? Is that, what does that sound like? You know, what is that? So in Lugha Arabiya, Allahumma is basically ism fi'l. What does that mean? So in Lugha Arabiya, there are certain abbreviations. Ish, Allahumma, for example. Okay. Alash, for example, we would think of it as that's colloquial, or that's slang, but it actually isn't. It's actually ism fi'l, or for example, okay, that's basically ism fi'l بمعنى أتأوه or التأوه, to feel pain, to describe pain, or Allahumma, that's an abbreviation which means Ya Allah. Ya Allah and Rabbana, our Lord. So this would be Ya Allah, and it would basically be blended together, Allahumma. Who had mentioned that? That's Sibawayh. Well, Sibawayh is actually not Arabic, believe it or not, but he was actually Farisi. A lot to say in regards to the Persian scholars that had invested so much in Islamic studies. That's another thing to say, which you could actually take a whole semester just talking, semesters actually, just talking about that. You can even make a PhD dissertation on the different scholars that were Farisi that had invested in ulum al-Islam, whether we're speaking about Lugha Arabiya or whether we're speaking about fiqh, hadith, and the list goes on and on. So many names to mention. Okay, that's a different thing. Okay, أنزل علينا مائدة. Send down a مائدة. Well, wait a minute. Al-Ma'ida, and that's the reason why Surah Al-Ma'ida was actually called Al-Ma'ida. What is Al-Ma'ida anyways, and how is it different? So Al-Ma'ida would more be something that is put on a stand and not necessarily on the ground. What is put on the ground is called khiwan. That's basically to be put on the ground. So kind of like when you're picnicking. Well, right now, I mean, they're used to getting picnics on benches and stuff. But before, it was to lay out, this plated, I guess, sheet. It was usually red and white, and you would put it on the floor, and you would basically, that would be a khiwan. Il-Ma'ida would be kind of like a Japanese table, and they would put the meat over it, or not the meat, but the food over it, not the meat. I don't know why I was thinking about meat. Okay. Let's see. And that's why he said Al-Ma'ida would not be a Ma'ida. So we're not talking about necessarily the table, but we're actually talking about there's a meal on it. There's food on it. It was a whole meal, plus there was something that it was basically setting on. Okay, and he said it's different than khiwan, because khiwan would be something on the floor. Okay, so when you're looking at il-Ma'ida, it's basically the food, and sometimes it can be referred to the food and not necessarily to the food on the table, but it can sometimes be, that's why he said tajawuzan, that it can be referred to the food and not necessarily to the food that is put on some kind of a table. Okay, so to make the story short, okay, we're just gonna make the story short right there. So it was something, it was said, إن المائدة نزلت عليهم يوم الأحد غدوة وعشية فلذلك جعلوا الأحد عيدا. Okay, so what happened? Some scholars, they basically said that the supper was sent down to them on a Sunday. And that's why they basically had celebrated Sunday as being a holy day, as a holy day, as a day of sanctity, as a day of reminding them of a special day that basically gave that inspiration on that day. Okay, so where's the Eid coming from? Why did we say holy day and not holiday? Okay, so holy day basically is coming from Eid. Is the word Eid, okay, is the word Eid necessarily something that happens as, let's call it, happens every single year, or something that comes on a specific occasion, and kind of, which is what a holiday is or a holiday. Okay, comes on a specific occasion. It's every Sunday, or it's every Friday, or it's every this, or it's every, I don't know, October of this year, or maybe December of this year, whatever it is. That would be a holiday, but a holiday, sorry. But a holy day, is that what Prophet Isa was saying? That it would be a holy day. Eid, and Eid, something that would be, that we could celebrate, and something that would be a holy day for us to remember that it was that day, to commemorate a special occasion, to commemorate an inspiration, something to remind us of a special thing that happened. So that's one thing, is it holy day or is it holiday? That's that area of differences of opinions on what really is a Eid. Is a Eid named Eid because it happens at certain occasions that accompanies some kind of celebration, some kind of happiness, some kind of, I guess, we're speaking about people dressing up, and is that what a holiday is? Or is it a holy day to basically mean that it was a day that contains a certain sanctity. It contains a certain I guess a certain, what is the word that I could use, like a certain honor, a certain day, or that we would remember something holy happening on that day, and therefore we would commemorate this holy day by bringing in a respect and honor by a certain food that we would present, or a certain clothing that we would probably wear, or probably reaching out to family and friends to commemorate this holy day, because it is sharifun tashbihan bil Eid, that it's basically sharif, it's basically an honorable day, and therefore it would be something that our children li'ulana, in another qira'ah, not our children, but لِأُولَانَا وَأُخْرَانَا. That's another qira'ah. Is it لِأَوَّلِنَا or is it لِأُولَانَا here وَآخِرِنَا? But in another qira'ah, وَأُخْرَانَا. لِأُولَانَا would be in plural. So here لِأَوَّلِنَا are previous, the first ones, the early generations. وَآخِرِنَا in the later generations. In English, you can't really have earlier generations. Well, you can say earlier generation and later generation. So in the other qira'ah would be earlier generations, and later generations would be in a plural. But you could only put that S as an indication for that jama', but in Arabic you could see it's the combination, well, the conjugation is different. Okay, so Ibn Abbas also said, well, that's in order to say that the ones that were present and other ones that were not present to also enjoy, or at least get from the blessings of this. And that's why they said it would be a miracle that they would also attest to, and it would be an evidence. It would be basically give them provisions, and you are the best of those that would give the provisions, since you are al-Ghaniyul Hamid. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop right here because there's a lot to mention. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. I hope I didn't confuse you. I know there's so much to say.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Yeah, I am a little bit confused.
Me too. It was a lot of information.
I'm confused as to the event that was happening on the day that they asked for the Ma'ida. Were they running away and hiding because they were being persecuted, or were they fasting but living regular in the city? Like what was happening?
Right. So we don't actually have deep details what was really happening, what was the context of all of this. And that's why you will see there were some stories that are considered as part of al-Isra'iliyat, and they'll give you, what is al-Isra'iliyat? Let me write that word down and explain something. What are al-Isra'iliyat? So when you look at al-Isra'iliyat, sorry, but my cat basically took out one of those keys on my laptop, and now yeah, whatever. Okay, al-Isra'iliyat.
Maybe he's the reason the boxes showed up.
No, that was way before Haram Noura. We can't accuse him. Okay, so al-Isra'iliyat are basically the different reports, the different information that was taken from the people of the book. Okay, now here's one thing. Some of that information was coming from really the scriptures, okay, from the people of the book. And some of those scriptures were, one, the canonized ones. Am I writing this right? I don't know if this is a typo, and some of them were not canonized. In other words, they were attributed to the people of the book, but it wasn't actually something that you would find not in their scriptures, and probably just mentioned by people of the book, kind of like what we would see. It's not necessarily a scholar that said this information, but it just became so prevalent within a certain group of people that, of course, some Muslims might take it and say, "Oh, okay, well, we've got some information right there," and then they'll embed it sometimes even in tafsir and say, "Well, we've got some information right there," and hey, they'll basically say, "لا تصدقوا بني إسرائيل." Here we go. We're not going to necessarily believe everything that Bani Israel are basically saying, and plus, we're not going to deny it. وَلَا تُكَذِّبُوهُمْ. That's what the Prophet ﷺ said, but guess what? That's actually a little bit sometimes exaggerated. And unfortunately, we did have some scholars that sometimes, I would say, took from the Israeliyat, took from the stories that sometimes were actually fables amongst the people of the book and not necessarily something that the scriptures were saying. Okay, so not the canonized ones and not even the ones that were considered as not canonized. In other words, they were basically considered as not genuine. Okay, but still, it managed to find its way within the Muslim community because I guess of close proximity, with the people of the book and Muslims, etc. So we kind of would kind of see some of that information actually finding its way within the Muslim community, and you will find it even in the books of tafsir. So based on the ayat themselves, we don't really have enough information in order to understand what was really the context of all of this. Were they persecuted? Were they running away? Were they just sitting down in this place, kind of like the Last Supper and that drawing, they were together and 12 people and they were, just having a moment of discussion, and one of them just comes up with this idea and actually says that. We don't really know the whole context of what really surrounded all of this. In fact, I skipped some of those pages. You saw that they weren't highlighted. You're going to see some more of that. They went in certain details and started talking about what that meal looked like. There was a fish and 5 pomegranates, and there was some, they sometimes even went in details of what kind of spices were used. But all of that, there was really no evidence to prove it. All right. No evidence. So will we find it in the books of tafsir? Certainly. You're gonna see it and you'll be surprised. I was like, oh, where did they get that from? And why would he even mention that? Let's see if I can, here we go. And right there we go. Look at that. And let's see. And how they were standing and what they were really saying and what they were dressed in. And then later, and they prostrated and Hawariyin prostrated along and all of that. They had a really nice smell. And then the meal was covered up. Okay, that's all right. It happens.
Sorry.
That's all right. And the food was covered, and then they uncovered it and all of that. There's really no evidence to prove. And here we go. It was a baked fish, and there was no bones in it, and it was basically dripping from all the different I guess ghee on it or whatever, all of that. And look at that. It even said that there was some beans and there was some salt, and there were 5 different pieces of bread and 5 different pomegranates and 5, or on another side there were some what's it called, dates and olives and all of that. There was really no evidence to prove any of that. So you could see some of those stories, like look at all of this, and these are all just going into details with all these stories, but we don't really have any evidence to prove that. You will find it in
tafsir. That kind of reminds me of this coworker I used to work with. She was her family's from Italy. They were Catholic. And for Christmas, they always make 12 different fishes. And I was asking her, I was like, you're really going to cook 12 different fishes for your Christmas dinner? And she said, yeah, it's tradition. I said, well, where's that tradition come from? And she said, because legend has it that during the Last Supper, there was 12 different fishes that was served.
Right. So when you're looking at legend has it, there you go. So you will find different legends. And, one of the best, probably Bart Ehrman, even though right now he's an agnostic, not a Christian, but Bart Ehrman actually did a lot of those studies in scrutinizing the text itself and when in history did such additions actually happen. And where did a lot of these stories, and in particular, he actually wrote a book. It's called, what was it? Was it called The Adulteress or something like that? I forgot what the book was called, but it was just speaking about one story, which is that lady that was brought to Prophet Isa alayhi salam, that she had
Mary
committed
Magdalene.
adultery. What was that?
I said Mary Magdalene. She was
Right,
the prostitute, right?
right. And she was brought over, and then he said, well, which one of you is of no sin? If you're of no sin, then you can stone her. Otherwise, then you can't stone her, because all of you are people of sin. In other words, it was to bring in, I guess, an aberration to the different laws that were in the Old Testament, which is stoning for someone that had committed adultery. Anyhow, so he basically does this study and proves by going back to the manuscripts and tells you exactly what year and at least what time in history and when in history this was embedded in the manuscripts and in the Bible, and how in the earlier manuscripts you didn't actually have this story. So same thing if we're talking about so many other things. You can say that a lot of Israeliyat were trying to go in details and actually explain what were they persecuted, what happened, but we don't really have, let's call it, authentic evidence to explain to us exactly what had happened, what was the context of all of this. We don't have that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Just one more question. So just so I don't lose the forest for the trees, this is an important story. It's told in our tradition, Christian tradition, and it's widely known, and all this detailed history has been recorded about it. But what is the takeaway lesson or message?
Good job. Good job. So that's what we're going to be talking about, inshallah, next week, because the story did not end. You still have a whole page that is basically the takeaway of this whole story. The story didn't finish yet.
Okay.
So this is to be continued.
Okay. Because I was feeling a little lost. I was like, okay, I see there's differences of opinions on why they asked.
Where are we going with all of this? Why
what
is
am I
this
supposed to learn?
Right. What's the lesson learned? Where are you trying to go with all of this and all that? So that's what, of course.
Okay, I thought I missed it though.
No, not yet. Not yet. We still didn't get there yet.
Okay, alhamdulillah.
I know sometimes it kind of, it becomes hard when you're sinking in 1A and you're going into each and every single word and you're like, okay, what are you trying to get to? And we're like, oh, I still didn't get there. I know that, I'm breaking down the ayat too much, but we're going to get there. But in the theme itself would not be something that you would see, let's call it the weight of it, unless you basically had seen these little pieces and where they're going. So
yeah, it's really interesting. I learned more about this story than I've ever known about it in my whole life. Is fascinating, really.
So I will have to actually end right here because I have an appointment to run to, and inshallah we'll see you tomorrow.